So thank you so much. Hopefully you can stick around a little bit late to hear the full presentations. So just a quick introduction about myself. I am Dr. Danielle Ignace. I am an assistant professor of forest and conservation sciences at the University of British Columbia. I am brand new there. We just moved to the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, otherwise known as Vancouver. And you can find me at Ignace Lab on Twitter, online, and I'm also a member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and that's on my father's side. And on my mother's side, I'm also Menominee. And I'll turn it over to Briana to introduce herself.
Yeah, nice. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Briana Brown. I am the Associate Director for the National Science Policy Network. You can add me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect. And one thing I want to point out before we get started is in the bottom of each screen, you'll see a QR code where you can find references for all the information on the slides. Thank you.
Right, so to give some context to what we're working on today is that we have known for a long time that scientists have done an exceptional amount of work to understand how our climate is changing. Just a few hits and highlights from this work is that we see a rise in global temperature, which is tightly linked to a rise in atmospheric CO2. We see decreases in Arctic ice, decreases in ice sheets, and we also see a retreating of glacier levels across the world. We've seen an enormous amount of the rising of sea levels across the world, and we've also seen an enormous amount of heat that gets absorbed by these oceans. And it's at this point, it's well known that human activities have caused primarily nearly all of this climate change. And so now we're starting to see the direct impacts of that, which include many different facets of our life, including drought, extreme events like hurricanes. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more in the news about wildfires and how they're displacing many different communities. So now we're starting to see many of the ramifications of all that change in the climate. And here's a visualization from NASA. And as you can see, over time, we're starting to heat up, and you see the more orange and yellows and reds that we see on the map over time means that we have these increases, these temperature anomalies higher than the long-term average. And so what this basically means is that we're starting to see everything heat up. 2020 and 2016 were tied for the hottest years on record. The last 7 years have been the hottest 7 years on record, and we will continue to see these records being broken. Stop visualizing. There we go. So if we zoom into Texas, and specifically this region of the world, we are also starting to see things heat up. Of course, we are kind of fresh off of thinking about disasters like Hurricane Harvey, but also wildfires that the state has to deal with. But we're also seeing dramatic changes, even from 1975 to 2020, dramatic increases as shown as these dark red regions here. These regions in Texas are starting to heat up, and these are major threats to public health, the water supply, and the state's infrastructure. If we zoom in even more to Houston, Texas, 2020 climate assessment report was completed by climate experts, and they looked at long-term data from 1950 and 11 of the weather stations across Houston, and they were able to make predictions into the long-term future, so 2100. And based off of all of that data, they were able to say that Houston is predicted to see hotter days and nights, longer heat waves, and even heavier rainfall, if you can believe it. If you live in that area, it's already pretty extreme, and so we're expected to see even more extreme changes. And a study was completed, a really extensive study looking at threats of global warming, including climate change, as well as perception of global warming. And this was done for each state. It was done across the nation. But one particular question that was added to the survey was, is global warming harming me personally? And what was interesting, if you look at Texas, and you can see the different ranges here on on this in terms of percentage. Despite the majority of those living surveyed in Texas, 72% believe that global warming was happening, but only 43% of those people believed that it would harm them personally. So we have a strong disconnect between what is actually happening and the perception of what could happen. And if we look at another study from Johns Hopkins, did for every state in the US, looked at how vulnerable and prepared each state was. I won't get into the details now to save time, but Texas was reported to be one of the most vulnerable states to the effects of climate change, while being the least prepared to deal with some of the public health issues and environmental health issues. So we have compounding this an environmental injustice problem where not only is Texas least prepared, but the Black and Brown communities in Houston are most impacted by some of these climate change and environmental threats, while being the least consulted on these problems. Not only that, but contributing the least to these environmental threats. And this is particularly significant if we think about someone special to the environmental justice movement, Dr. Robert Bullard, who's a professor of urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University. And his work was so important in finding that in Houston, in particular, in the 1930s to 1978, that the majority of city-owned landfills, incinerators, and privately owned landfills in Houston were located in predominantly Black neighborhoods. This helped fuel a lawsuit in Houston, which was the first environmental discrimination case using civil rights law, and this also happened to fuel the environmental justice movement. I'll turn it over to Briana.
Yeah, so with that, it's super clear that we've identified a hidden problem of climate change and environmental hazards. It's an issue that not only affects our world, our country, our cities, but more importantly, it impacts communities of color without their knowledge and often without their input. And so to begin to solve this problem, Danielle and I decided to brainstorm a community-centered solution that will hopefully transcend beyond our time as fellows and contribute to long-term efforts for climate change. So to begin our research project, we did a community analysis and we sent out a pre-survey to people in our personal networks of about 30. And from that group, we wanted to gauge what people knew about climate change and the impacts on them and their community. And so from that, you'll see that most people identify climate change as an issue, followed by pollution, specifically hurricanes and flooding. Something I thought that was really interesting was that no one thought sea levels rising was an issue. So that kind of highlighted a bigger disconnect of what people understand with climate change. Another question we asked were, what were some of the societal impacts associated with the environmental issue that they referenced in the slide before? And a big one was basic access to resources, followed by public safety well-being, increased health problems, economic impacts, and then some of the other comments were loss of lives in these areas based on toxic dumps and other issues in the community. And last but not least, we decided to add a question about what people thought the solution was. I think in social research, we know that most times if you ask someone what they think the answer is to a problem, they'll have some kind of suggestion. And so from that, the majority of our participants stated that policy change was one of the most ideal things that could solve this problem, and accountability to those people who are in these places of power, followed by access to resources, access to information, and financial support as well. And so, yeah, so in addition to talking to people in the community, we did a landscape analysis to further identify, what needs are we seeking to address, potential collaborators, what groups are doing things, what information is already out there. And so what we found was that there's a lot of enthusiasm regarding climate change. It's the new hot topic. Everyone's talking about it. There's lots of research, lots of data, lots of groups committed to the cause. But what we also found was that there's a lot of groups working independently of each other. And for some of the larger scale initiatives, there was a vital piece missing, which was that community engagement and community feedback. And so specifically, we found Resilient Houston is a plan that they launched in February 2020. And Danielle will talk a little bit more about that and its implications.
Right. So Resilient Houston, developed in 2020, has hundreds of pages of a plan, and it's essentially a framework for how Houston can adapt to and mitigate climate change. It has 5 chapters and 18 goals and targets and many different action plans. And so, if you look at all of this, well, actually, it was helped funded by Shell. It does bring together local, regional, national, even global partners. But I think one key piece missing in this Resilient Houston framework is actually the community. How is the community engaged in this process? And so after 1 year, what is the report? What's the progress on this? The Rice University Kinder Institute is tracking this. I should say, all of those 18 goals are really ongoing. And it also has a very long-term goal of being implemented in 2025 or 2040. So how does that help the people of today? And also, with all of that money and sponsorship from these big partners such as Shell, where is the money going? Well, that has been an elusive component to track down. And in talking to various colleagues in Houston in particular, including scholars, no one had heard of the Resilient Houston plan. So despite a couple of press releases being out there, there was very little engagement with local experts as they never heard of it. And there was no details on the community engagement, how they are affected, and what they want to see come out of this.
Absolutely. So from that, we see clearly there's a lot of work to be done, and someone has to do it. And I think Danielle and I wanted to initiate that process. And so we established some project goals ranging from forming partnerships to engaging with community members, working smarter, not harder, and to amplify the work that's already being done. That's the next one. Finding ways to communicate the science and the impacts of climate change, and also providing ways for people to get that contact information on how they can get involved. We can go to the next one. We're going to zoom past these two, but most importantly, we want to provide a platform for people to voice their concerns, making sure that people feel heard, valued, and are able to get their concerns addressed. And with that being said, this is how you can get involved. Do your own landscape community analysis, identify your stakeholders and allies, most importantly, mobilize and get out there and make a difference. And with that, Danielle, go ahead with the thank yous.
All right, we'll give a special thank you to the Science for Social Equity team, especially Dr. Janine Abrams-McLean, Raj Sutton, and all the fellows, Fair Count, Black Voices for the Black Fund, and community partners, Citizens Climate Lobby, as well as Rice University. Here is our contact information if you would like to get involved, and thank you for your commitment to the cause.